Okay, welcome back again. Welcome to this series on power in the Church of England. And I hope you've all had a very good coronation weekend and celebrated the new king being enthroned. And it's probably a good place to start thinking about power and the role power plays within our society and the community, and most importantly, the church. I'm Anderson Jeremiah, and I'm based in the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion at Lancaster University. And this webinar series is a joint venture of the Michael Ramsey Center for Anglican Studies at Durham University and the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion at Lancaster University. So our aim has been in the past year and a half is to explore the many forms of power that shapes the life of the Church of England in its various manifestations, the ways in which these forms of power shape people's experience in and around the church, and also the various accounts of power, theological, sociological, for instance, that circulates in and around the church, both within its systems and also in the lived manifestations of the church. We've also been exploring what it means for power to be exercised in healthy ways, not necessarily in a negative manner, but also how power could be seen in a positive manner. And also the nature and impact of the misuse and abuse of power. So these have been some of the themes that we have been looking in the past. And for those who have missed the previous ones, please do look at the repertoire of previous recordings. And if you're interested, you could follow most of those recordings. In today's seminar, we are really delighted to have Sandra Cobbin, who is with us. And she is one of the lead coaches in an organization called Clarity Development. So Sandra is a freelance coach, trainer, and mediator. She works primarily with church leaders. Amongst other things, she runs leadership development training for curates and for clergy taking up roles of primary responsibility. And she's a transition coach for bishops and deans. And she offers team coaching to leadership teams, including in cathedrals. As a mediator, she works with church congregations, leadership teams, and church colleagues who are experiencing painful disagreement and need someone to accompany them as they seek ways forward. So these are only very few introductions. Obviously, she spends quite a lot of time in helping people engage with real power. Before I hand it over to Sandra, I also would like to thank Rachel Murray and Gill, Behenna, who are our BSL interpreters today. Thank you for your help for this evening. Now over to Sandra, and she will give us her insights and will lead us in the next session of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Anderson. Thank you. And it's very good to be with you all this evening. Good to see some familiar names on the screen and also lots of people I've not met before. So I'm looking forward to our discussion, our conversation later on. Thank you there for that introduction, Anderson. And I guess that's quite a good place to start, because why power? Why did I do an MA research on power? What compelled me almost to do that? And I think it's the three strands of work that have just been outlined to you. So having spent about 15 years as a transition coach with new diocesan bishops and with new deans, actually quite often those conversations, either overtly or more implicitly, are about power. perhaps a new sources of power that these people are receiving in this new role. Also, I had some time ago now worked part-time for a couple of bishops who had a role in the House of Lords. And it was really interesting to observe that place of power and to see how different people engaged with it and how different people engaged with the power that came with that access, with that seat, with that place, and seeing how bishops tried to inhabit that place of power as well. And then, of course, my work as mediator. The more I reflect on mediation and working with churches or with colleagues in dispute with one another, the more I just see power, strands of power running through conflict. And of course, as an external expert, actually needing to think personally about the power that I have as I go into accompany a congregation or work with colleagues to help them to see if they can find a helpful and constructive way through their conflict. So I guess those are the sort of three strands that led me to be just very curious about power. And I reached a point where I thought, I really need to do something about this. I want to explore it. And I was really keen to do something that might be useful for the Church of England. So not simply to do the academic research for my own sort of interest, but actually to produce something that then could be offered to the church for them to read or not, to engage with or not, but something that I hoped would be useful. So let me just screen share, and then there's some slides that will accompany what I'm going to be saying to us. So this is the question that I asked when I was setting up my research. So how do bishops in the Church of England understand power? And what implications does this understanding have for the way that they undertake their role and work? And that was the question that I wanted to explore. There were three strands to my research. I looked at theoretical literature, so philosophy, psychology, some business literature as well. What is being written? What is understood about power? What can I draw out of that? Then I wanted to look at theological literature, and there was a vast amount to be open to. So in consultation with my supervisor, what we actually decided is that I would focus on what's being written at the moment by people in the Church of England about power. So a very narrow lens, really, to see what was being written now about power. The exception to that was the ordinal. It felt really important in that theological literature to also be reading and drawing from the ordinal and the language of the ordinal. And then the third was interviews with diocesan bishops. And I wanted to focus on diocesan bishops as the most senior bishop in the diocese. And ideally, I wanted 2 or 3 diocesan bishops to interview. But knowing bishops and diaries, I realised that I was probably going to have to ask 10 or 12 bishops, and I might get a couple who were able to be interviewed. So I put together my list of 12, my long list, trying to make that as diverse as possible in terms of different styles of diocese, lengths of time as a bishop, gender, church tradition, and so on. Trying to make that as broad as possible. And just as I was about to send the invitations out, COVID struck. And I thought, I'm not going to send anything. The bishops will be running around trying to work out how to deal with what's just happening. And I just left it for 2 or 3 weeks. So by the time I sent my invitation emails out to these 12 bishops, I was very surprised to find that 11 came back and said that they would be interested in participating in my research. And I think I just got a sweet spot where their diaries had been cancelled. They'd just got over the busyness at the beginning of the lockdown and weren't yet busy again. And so although that's a massive amount of data to receive and to process and to engage with, actually, I decided, because I wanted the research to be relevant and make a difference and be useful, I would go with the 11 diocesan bishops, which was an absolute privilege to have that amount of data in the research. And then what I did is a conversation between these 3 strands as I did the research and wrote that up. So I want to just start with this question, and I guess it's already been hinted at by Anderson, just think for a moment, perhaps for yourself, is power good or bad? Why might that question be important? What perhaps is the purpose of power? What are your experiences of power, and how do they colour your response to that question? I think what was intriguing to me is that predominantly in both the theological literature and the theoretical literature, power was seen to be a bad thing, to be power over, to be oppressive, domination, manipulation, control. So broadly and generally, power being seen as a bad thing. There were some articulations of power that were good, so it's not exclusive. But I was really intrigued that predominantly in all of the three strands of my research, power was generally seen to be something that when exercised is bad, is oppression or manipulation. Rather less so the images on here of the power of love or of collaboration or of working together or of and so on, or power for others. For those of you that prefer words, here are some words that just pick up some of the themes in those images that I've just shown you there. There were 4 themes from the research which I'd like to share with you this afternoon. One was structural power, and that's about how a power is distributed through an organisation or a group, how it fixes onto different roles, what power is given in different parts of the organisation. I guess that's the hard power of authority. That's the power of setting agendas, perhaps, or of determining who's in the room. That sort of power, the power to reward or to punish, would be hard or structural power. Cultural power was another strand. And this is the norms, the values, both explicit and implicit, about power and how it's used. So it's like the unwritten rules of what's appropriate or inappropriate in the use of power in an organisation. Then there was relational power, which sometimes is known as soft power. So influence, persuasion. Also, I think in there things like articulation, winsomeness, knowledge, those sort of softer aspects that come out of relationship and that are exercised in that way. Those were the 3 themes that I went into the interviews with, having done the theological and theoretical literature research. But then what came up in the interviews was a 4th theme of symbolic power. And having just had this weekend with the coronation, we may be in a very good place to reflect on symbolic power. So symbol as a source of power, which, for example, with bishops might be as simple as the robes that they wear or the place that they stand in the cathedral procession. So I'll pick up some of these later as we go on. But first, let's go back to this notion of power being good or bad. So I think it's interesting that this is predominantly seen as a bad thing, as manipulation or oppression. And I was intrigued that when I talked to the bishops, that also came through quite strongly in their sense of power. And I guess I wonder whether some of that might be informed by the history of abuse in the church. But I think it may be wider than that as well. So they didn't want a lot of power. Some of the power they had, they were uncomfortable with. They certainly didn't want more power. Sometimes they might have wanted a bit more power to be able to intervene in places where there was conflict or trouble, but actually often pulled back on reflection from that as well. So interesting to see as they reflected on power, how that came through. I think just a note that I also didn't notice any distinction between gender, which was interesting because I was expecting to, but I understand there's quite a bit of research about women, sort of the pioneer women in other sectors, which seems to demonstrate that first generation of women are often experiencing things very much as the men experience them. And it's almost more interesting to talk to the second generation who may well be experiencing power different and might have something different to say to us if we were to ask. And in terms of ethnic diversity, the time I did my research, which was 2020, Archbishop Sentimi was just retiring, and there were no bishops who were not of a white British heritage. So I wasn't able to explore in any way the way that ethnic diversity might impact on this subject. And I'd love to. And if I was to do the research again now, that would be possible, because the profile of the bishops has changed. So let's look at the structural and cultural power. So the structural power is how power is distributed through an organisation, and the cultural power is the sort of unwritten rules, the explicit and implicit norms and values of power. And what came through was explicitly the Church of England talks about power, that more than enough power, that power is shared. So that's the shared cure of souls, for example, that's spoken about, or the synodical processes for decision making would be another way of demonstrating through the structures that cultural power of sharing power, enough power to share. And images of servant and shepherd came through very strongly as well. And the servant image I want to pick up a little bit later when I'm talking to you. So talking to the bishops, thinking about culture and structural power, explicitly, there was lots about there being enough power to share. But interestingly, in the interviews, implicitly, their experience, certainly in the national church, was that power was finite, it was limited, it was more like a cake where there were slices. There was almost an implied scarcity of power. And their observation is that felt very often as if that led to competition for power within the national church institutions. So perhaps in synod, maybe in the House and College of Bishops, maybe working with the NCIs in Church House. So explicitly, there's enough power to share, but implicitly, that wasn't their experience. In fact, their experience was competition for power within the national church. There was a contrast, though, when they talked about in the diocese. So in the diocese, these diocesan bishops that I interviewed talked about there being plenty of power. In fact, there was more than enough for them to give power away, which they regularly did. And their approach to power was to share it, or to delegate it, or to empower, or to give away. So that contrast between their experience in national church and in the diocese. What we know about culture, though, is that it permeates through a whole organisation. So I came out of my research quite intrigued to find out whether in the diocese others felt the same way as the diocesan bishops did in national church, or whether actually they felt the same way as the bishops did in the diocese. And it's only anecdotal because it's after my research, but I've chatted with suffragan and area bishops when given the opportunity. And interesting to hear that actually their experience in the diocese is very much more like a cake, where there is often a sense that there's not quite enough power and an experience of competition for power. So interesting perhaps to wonder whether the bishop's experience, the diocesan bishop's experience, might have been that their slice of the power cake was plenty big enough, and that perhaps helped them to feel that there was quite a lot of power to go around, and that might not be the experience of others around them. So interesting to sort of perhaps explore that a little bit more. Let's move on. So sources of personal power, and here we talked about. I think I might have just turned over 2 pages. No, I haven't. Here we go. Structural power being authority power. So hard power, the power that comes with a role. Permission giving, signing things, one of the bishops said, appointments, those sort of authority power that they have. They felt that was limited, but actually were very content with the fact that that was limited. They generally did not seek more authority power. They were much more comfortable with and comfortable talking about their relational power, the softer power of influence, and working relationally, collaboratively with others. Many bishops talked about giving power away in their relational use of power. So Nye, who came up initially with the hard and soft power, also talked about smart power, which is the intentional combination of hard and soft power. So choosing circumstance by circumstance, encounter by encounter, which sources of hard and soft power to draw in to that specific situation. And it was interesting hearing a couple of bishops just talking about trying to encourage open and honest conversations. One talked about trying to do that with their area deans, and another talked about trying to do it with their staff team, but actually finding that really hard. So wanting to draw on their relational power as a way to enable these honest and open conversations, and yet finding that there was something still about their authority power in the room. The bishop was still the bishop, and actually that seems to be having an effect on people's willingness to be open and honest or to disagree. So I think there's interesting dynamics here which bishops were exploring. So let's just look at symbolic power, which, as I said, came through in the interviews and was really interesting to hear bishops pondering this. One of the bishops talked about those early days in that first lockdown of COVID. There were new mortuaries being opened in some places, and the council asked this bishop to go to an opening of a new mortuary, and reflected that the bishop was saying that they didn't really know why they were there or what was expected of them, but there just seemed to be something symbolically important about having a bishop in a place of death and of fear. There were two bishops who talked about the position in the procession in the cathedral, being at the back of the procession. But interestingly, one of them said that was because the bishop was the cathedral was theirs. This was the place from which their ministry began. And the other talked about being at the back because they were a servant of all. And that led me to a conclusion that the meaning of a symbol is interpreted by those involved and also by others. So interesting, if we'd have asked all the people in the cathedral why the bishop's at the back of the procession, we may have got a whole host of other explanations for the meaning of that symbol. And so there is power that comes from symbol, but actually sometimes that will be interpreted in different ways by different people and may not be quite how the user of that power is intending it to be understood. And then finally, just turning to theologies of power and its source and purpose. So I looked at the ordinal, and that was really helpful in just giving some of the articulation of this. And I looked at some other literature too, but I really think there's an opportunity here for some more thinking and writing, and that's why I'm so encouraged what's going on with these webinars and some of the research that's been shared here, because there just seems to be a gap. There's an opportunity for some more thinking to be done theologically about power. So one of the people I looked at quite a bit was a writer called Stephen Sykes, and he talked about power in the Church of England. Sorry, I need to bring my slide down. There was quite a bit around servant leadership, partly because that was quite a strong theme in the interviews with the bishops. So what does servant leadership say about power? And then the Faith and Order Commission had done a report on being human, which was really helpful in just thinking through theologically about power. So those were some of the sources that I looked at. Interestingly, in the interviews, the 11 diocesan bishops, there was no really consistent theological framing of power, its source, its purpose. Some people had done quite a bit of thinking personally, but there was nothing coming strongly across the group. As I say, servant leadership, if anything, was more predominant, but not strongly. And interestingly, servant leadership was framed as giving away power. So there were two places that bishops tended to go to articulate their understanding of servant leadership. One was Philippians 2, and one was the washing of the disciples' feet. And an interpretation of those two passages as being about Jesus giving up power, Jesus modelling powerlessness, and therefore drawing conclusions that leaders ought to be giving away their power. So some really interesting theological framings, which we may want to discuss when we come to our discussion. I think there's some interesting tension between service and power. The Fayot report was really helpful in thinking about how service might be an expression of power, how perhaps being created in the image of God, we all are created therefore to have power, and how might that change our thinking about power if that were our theological approach. Perhaps does Jesus, rather than model powerlessness, does he redefine power perhaps as humility, as vulnerability, as meekness? And maybe there's something that doesn't quite add up between saying that powerlessness is a thing that we abhor, and yet then wanting to say that power is bad and we shouldn't have it. So there were some quite interesting strands of theological discussion to perhaps be had around that. So let me stop screen sharing and hand back to Anderson.
Thank you, Sandra. I really like that you finished with there was no consistent theological framework for power. And I think you have really shared quite a lot of important insights from your research. So perhaps this is a good time for you to share those questions with us.
Lovely, yeah, will do. Thank you, Anderson. Thank you. Thank you for the questions. It's been a really stimulating conversation. So thank you so much for that. Let me screen share again. And these are just some, I find it's really easy for the session. So I've done some seminars for bishops and deans. I do some input onto the senior leadership development programme for the Church of England. I do some input on power to the gathering of new suffragan and area bishops. I work with curates and first incumbents training or equivalent. And I've also been asked to do various sort of individual things. So a DDO asked me to come and spend some time with their team just talking about power within their roles as DDO. So there's all sorts of places where I've been sort of taking this and exploring it and just enabling conversations to take place. And I like to try and end anything that I do by just holding up a mirror and inviting us to reflect on ourselves personally. So first of all, there's just that question about what sources of personal power I might have. And there might be some that I'm less comfortable with than others. There may be some that I just don't see. So how might I, going back to that accountability, how might there be people around me who could speak into that for me to help me to see, to notice, to become aware of sources of power that I might be unaware of? Because my sense is that more we can know that the palette of sources of power that I have personally, the more I can be aware of how I'm using it, perhaps even choosing different sources of power in different situations. When I don't notice sources of power, then that perhaps becomes more the risk that I'm using power in a way that's not helpful or perhaps is even harmful. So something about how do we do some work on identifying our sources of power, and which of those are we perhaps a little bit uncomfortable about, and then what might we do about that? The other is this one, and I sometimes give this as a task to people to take away and spend some time doing this and then to come back when I'm doing some coaching around this. So I'm just curious as to why we tend to notice power used badly and perhaps don't so often notice when power is used well. So I guess this is touching to the predominant view in all of the literature, the different strands of literature and in the interviews, that power generally is seen to be a bad thing, about domination or manipulation or oppression. And I guess I'm just wondering, is that partly then reinforced because those are the sorts of exercises of power that we notice? And what might we need to do in our attitude, in our approach to become more aware of, to notice power used well? Because as we notice power used well, that might then shape our behaviour. It also might gradually broaden our perspective of power and its value. So that's just some questions that might be helpful. And the other was in my research, I drew the research to a close by exploring just a little bit this notion that maybe there's enough power to go around. And I did, and it's a little hackneyed, I know, but I did a little bit of a riff on 1 Corinthians 13. And I offer this to you as a sort of close. I'm really happy to pick up some more questions, but just in terms of me giving input. So let me move this so that I can see the whole thing and read it out to you. So what if there's more than enough power to go around? Power is infinite and limitless. Power does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. Power is attentive to the power in others, because this is how we see God. Power is not self-interested, but acts justly, always seeking justice. Power is generous and courageous, merciful and humble. Power does not oppress, dominate, or overwhelm, because by doing so, we lose sight of ourselves, each other, and God. Power always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. I just offer that as perhaps a reframing of power in a different way.
Wow, that's well, that's I don't think we can question anything beyond that. That's a beautiful reworking of what you just suggested. Perhaps maybe on that note, we can draw this webinar to a close. If nobody has any pressing thing desperately needing to comment on power, we will say a huge thanks to Sandra for the helpful way that she was able to share her research and also unpack some of those aspects, and then ending with a beautiful writing of that Corinthian passage. So thank you so much for this evening, and thank you also to each and every one of you for actively participating. And when the recording is available, we will share it, and please do share it. I think this is a very important topic. For those who are part of the General Synod might have received the email today, how we have to prepare for the next session in July, which is going to be a pretty important session. And one of the challenge will be how power is going to be exercised in that context. So do share this when it's made available. So regarding the future seminars, it will be announced later as it's being worked. And there will be another exciting set of list of people who will be sharing their reflections on power in the Church of England. So thanks again to Gill and Rachel for helping us in this session. So thank you and have a very good evening.